But the chilling thing was that Jackson's opponent had fired at him, and the opponent thought that he had missed. And the guy, Dickinson, was the best shot in Tennessee. And he had fired at Jackson, and Jackson stood there, and nothing happened. He didn't fall over, he didn't die, he didn't spurt blood or anything. And this guy Dickinson was astonished. He had never missed a man in a duel. And, he could have thought, well, maybe I missed his heart or something, but I certainly hit him. But no, Jackson just stood there as strong as could be. And so Jackson puts down his gun, aims at Dickinson. They're 8 paces, 24 feet apart, from here to there. And Jackson pulls the lever, and click, nothing happens. It didn't go off. And so the seconds come up and they check, well, was it a misfire or a miscock? The ruling came down. After examining the replay, it was a miscock, which meant that Jackson got to fire again. Now, I'm thinking, and we historians sometimes put ourselves in the feet of the people that we're examining. What would I have done under the circumstances? Maybe I am. You are too. More magnanimous than Andrew Jackson. Because I would have said, okay, all right, I've proved my point. And it was accepted protocol at that point to shoot in the air, to show you're above this kind of thing. Not Jackson. He leveled that pistol right at Charles Dickinson. And Dickinson, of course, who had been sweating bullets the first time around, when he's waiting for Jackson to shoot him and the gun doesn't fire, they think, oh God, I'm saved. And now, 15 seconds later, Jackson is leveling the gun again, shoots him, and kills him. And there were people in the United States who were, well, Jackson wasn't famous at the time, so I was about to say there are lots of people in the United States who were appalled at this. No, they became appalled later when Jackson ran for president. And they thought, oh my God, we might elect somebody who kills a man in cold blood. Now, I didn't tell you the rest of the story. In fact, Dickinson's bullet had hit Jackson and missed his heart by ½ an inch, and it stayed there for the rest of Jackson's life. He carried this bullet around with him. But when Andrew Jackson became your enemy, this was serious stuff. And Andrew Jackson did not make enemies lightly. He didn't go around dueling with everybody in sight, but if you insulted his wife, then that was grounds for a duel. And probably a quarter of the American electorate, when Jackson ran for president in 1824 and again in 1828, thought that this fact alone disqualified him for the presidency. Any man who would duel, what a barbarous custom. And they said, we'll never have anything to do with Andrew Jackson. But a majority of the American electorate apparently took the idea that, well, yeah, he insulted his wife. That's what I would have done too. Good for Andy Jackson. Now, the larger point here is, and I'll come back to this, one of the secrets of success in American politics is the ability to make enemies. To make enemies and to use your enemies in the way you want to use them. Now, this might seem to be quite at odds with the most common approach to politics, where you think of politicians as trying to make everybody like them. And some politicians follow that approach. But I would argue, and I'll argue this evening, that the most successful politicians, the presidents who really make changes in the American political culture, who really get the laws, the changes that they want, are the presidents who know how to make enemies and to use their enemies. And I'll come back to this at the end when I discuss maybe some of the candidates who are running for president right now. Anyway, Andrew Jackson made friends and he made enemies. I told you a little bit about the enemies. Now I'll tell you about his friends. People who served under Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812, to a man, loved, admired, respected Andrew Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson, you know his nickname, Old Hickory. He acquired the nickname Old Hickory when he marched a band of Tennessee volunteers from Tennessee down to the Mississippi River at Natchez 500 miles through wilderness, Indian territory. He had taken this army down there at the behest of the U.S. War Department. And when he got down there, the War Department said, you know what? We don't think we're going to need you guys. Go on home. And the War Department gave the order to disband Jackson's army. These were simply volunteers. So they didn't have to be paid. They didn't have to be supported. And Jackson refused to send his men home. He couldn't turn them loose 500 miles from home. They didn't have money to get home. They didn't have provisions to get home. He was going to either stay in Mississippi, head down to New Orleans, or he'd take them home himself. And when it became clear that he wasn't going to take them down to New Orleans at that point, later he would go back to New Orleans, but he decided to lead them home himself. He ignored the orders from the War Department, and he put his own fortune on the line, writing IOUs for the provisions that his army required to get home. A lot of his men had gotten sick. He refused to leave the sick along the way, so they were all carted back, and the army returned to Tennessee. Jackson had to deal with a reprimand from Washington. He had to figure out how to pay the bills for all of this, but he acquired a reputation on the march back as someone who stood by his men, who put the interests of his men above his own personal interests, who put the interests of his men above the orders from Washington, who was willing to stake his fortune, his honor, his future on the welfare of his men. And it was on this trip back that somebody looked at Jackson sitting on his horse. He was a thin guy. He had chronic digestive problems. He often lived just on bourbon and coffee. And looked at him and they said, you know, he's like a hickory branch. He's tough. He might have to bend sometimes, but he'll never break. And that's how he got this nickname. And it was a nickname that denoted the affection that Jackson's men had for him. One of Jackson's soldiers was a guy named John Eaton. And John Eaton was a capable lieutenant, and he became a colonel under Jackson later in the war. And he served on Jackson's staff, and he commanded a unit that fought gallantly against the British and against the Indians during the War of 1812. And here it's just worth a reminder that the War of 1812 was nominally against the British, but it was equally against Britain's Indian allies on the frontier. So John Eaton became a favorite of Jackson, became a surrogate son of Jackson. This is important in understanding Jackson's psychology. Andrew Jackson never had any natural-born children. And so he wound up adopting or taking in several foster children. He adopted a nephew formally who became Andrew Jackson Jr. And when I was doing the book on Jackson, it was hard keeping straight which of the Andrew Jacksons we were talking about, because Jackson was so famous and beloved in the neighborhood around Nashville, Tennessee, that it seemed as though every third family was naming a child Andrew Jackson. You know, Andrew Jackson Jones, Andrew Jackson this. They were Andrew Jackson Jacksons. And so when people would talk about Andrew or Andrew Jackson, I had to figure out, okay, and I actually had to make a chart of who the Andrew Jacksons were and how they were related to the real Andrew Jackson and what the connection was. Anyway, Sam Houston, the famous Texan, became, in essence, a surrogate son to Andrew Jackson. John Eaton, his lieutenant from the War of 1812, became the equivalent of a surrogate son as well. And Andrew Jackson ran for president, or more precisely, he stood for president in 1824. And he lost a close and bitter contest. In the election of 1824, no one of the four candidates got a majority in the Electoral College. And as a result, the decision went to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, the second place finisher, John Quincy Adams, Jackson got the largest number of popular votes and the largest number of electoral votes. But he didn't get a majority of the electors, and so he didn't win. The race went to the House of Representatives.